Hello, and welcome to Mind Sherlock, where every story feels like a conversation over a warm cup of coffee. Today, I bring you a brand new Sherlock Holmes mystery, filled with twists, clues, and clever deductions. Make yourself comfortable, and let's unravel the case together. And if you'd like, leave a quick comment and tell me where you're joining from. It's always a pleasure to know where our little detective community is tuning in from. Now, let's get started. It was on a tempestuous evening in early March that I found myself once more ensconced within the familiar quarters of 221B Baker Street. Outside, the wind hurled itself against the windows with a fury worthy of the North Sea, while the steady patter of rain upon the glass added a rhythmic counterpoint to the howling gale. Within, however, the fire crackled warmly in the hearth, and Holmes, that singular man of method and mystery, reclined in his usual armchair, fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes half closed in apparent reverie. For my part, I occupied the settee opposite, perusing the latest edition of The Lancet. The journal, which had arrived only that morning, contained an article concerning a rare pulmonary affliction, and I read aloud a paragraph which struck me as curious. Holmes made no comment, nor did he shift his position, yet I knew he was listening. He always listened, even in seeming idleness. "You do not find that particular strain of pulmonary fibrosis of interest?" I inquired. "On the contrary," he murmured. "But I find the human symptoms of mendacity far more engrossing." I smiled, accustomed to his manner. There was a comfort in our routine. The storm outside, the warmth within, and Holmes's ceaseless battle with the world's dishonesty. It was then that the bell rang, sharply, twice, cutting through the room like a cry for help. Mrs. Hudson's footsteps could be heard on the stairs, followed by the opening of the door. Moments later she appeared, a touch breathless. "A young gentleman, sir. Says it's urgent." Holmes's eyes opened at once. "Then let him come," he said. "Urgency rarely waits on politeness." And so it began. The door opened to admit a young man, scarcely past 30, with tousled hair, pale cheeks, and an expression that hovered between alarm and shame. He removed his dripping hat and coat with trembling hands, casting anxious glances about the room before settling his gaze on Holmes. "You are Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he asked, his voice strained yet earnest. "I am, and this is my friend and colleague, Dr. Watson. Pray be seated. Your business, I presume, concerns more than the weather." "It does indeed," the man replied, lowering himself into the chair I offered. "My name is Dr. Alton Meredith. I have come about the death of Sir Reginald Compton." Holmes's eyes gleamed with sudden interest. "The Surrey industrialist." "The very same. He passed away 2 nights ago under circumstances officially deemed natural." "I was the attending physician." Holmes gestured for him to continue. "At first I thought the same, a final worsening of his long-standing pulmonary illness. But something haunts me about that night. His final moments were not peaceful. He awoke coughing violently, grasped my wrist, and uttered the strangest thing." "What did he say?" Holmes asked softly. "He knows the cough," Meredith replied, shivering. Then he went still. There was a silence broken only by the tapping of the rain upon the pane. "Mr. Holmes," the young doctor went on, "I am not given to fancies, but I cannot shake the notion that Sir Reginald did not die a natural death, and I believe I know who might have reason to hasten it." At this, Holmes leaned forward, his fingers steepled once more. "You have my full attention, Doctor." "Meredith," he said, "pray, speak plainly." Meredith swallowed visibly before continuing. I had been treating Sir Reginald for over a year. His lungs were weakened, yes, but he was not, in my professional estimation, near death. His energy was flagging, certainly, but there was no acute infection. The decline was steady, not precipitous. And yet his death came swiftly? Holmes asked. Yes. That night he had retired early, as was his custom. Around 11, the bell in his room rang violently. I rushed up only to find Nurse Lydia Faircroft already at his bedside. Was she his regular nurse? I asked. She had only been employed in the last month, recommended by a mutual acquaintance, I believe. Capable, calm, and attentive. Perhaps too much so. She claimed she'd heard him stirring and gone to check on him. I saw at once that he was in distress, coughing, struggling for breath. He tried to speak. He knows, the cough, then fell back and died. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Curious phrasing. Indeed, Meredith said, clasping his hands. Afterwards, I made out the death certificate, chronic respiratory failure. But the words would not leave me. The cough was different, wet, abrupt, almost artificial. You suspect poison? Holmes asked. I don't know, but the following morning I discovered something else. Sir Reginald's will had been altered, only days before his death, in fact. His previous heir, his niece Beatrice, was removed, and the entire estate granted to Miss Faircroft. Watson and I exchanged a glance. I have spoken with Miss Compton, Meredith added. She was shocked, but seemed resigned. Too resigned, if I may say. You believe Nurse Faircroft manipulated the will? I believe she may have done far worse. Holmes stood. And no one else has questioned the death? Not a soul. The family solicitor accepted the certificate. There was no autopsy. Holmes's expression became animated, his movements quick with purpose. Dr. Meredith, you have brought me a case most worthy of inquiry. A cough, you say. Let us see what truths may yet be expelled with it. There is one more detail, said Dr. Meredith, lowering his voice, though there were none but ourselves to hear. It concerns the late Sir Reginald's will. Holmes turned slightly in his chair, his gaze sharpening. Go on. Until a fortnight ago, Sir Reginald's principal beneficiary was his niece, Miss Beatrice Compton. She has long resided with him and was, by all accounts, his devoted companion. However, shortly after Nurse Lydia Faircroft arrived, the will was altered, quite legally, I must admit, and Miss Faircroft was made the sole heir. Interesting, Holmes murmured. More than that, Meredith pressed. The change was sudden. The family solicitor was summoned with urgency. No one else was informed until after the gentleman's death. Miss Compton herself only learned of it when the sealed copy was delivered the following morning. And the nurse? She showed no surprise. On the contrary, she behaved with a serenity I found unsettling. She claimed she had urged Sir Reginald to make provisions, lest there be confusion after his passing. But the new document strips Miss Compton of her share entirely. And Miss Compton's reaction? I inquired. She was devastated, but curiously silent. She has since retreated into herself. I believe she suspects something, but fears scandal. Holmes had begun to pace slowly, hands behind his back. You say Nurse Faircroft entered the household but a month ago? Precisely. Holmes paused. And already the old man changes his testament and dies within weeks, after uttering a cryptic remark involving a cough. Yes. Holmes's eyes gleamed with that peculiar brightness I had come to know well, the gleam of nascent pursuit. Dr. Meredith, he said, your nurse may have administered more than laudanum. With that, Holmes crossed to the window and stood for a moment in silence, the din of the rain serving as a muted backdrop to his thoughts. "There is enough in your account, Doctor. Meredith," he said at last, "to warrant serious inquiry. Whether it leads to crime or coincidence, we shall see." "I hoped you might say so," the young doctor replied earnestly. "I've done all I can within the confines of my position. I am but newly appointed to my practice, and I fear that accusations from one so junior would fall on deaf ears." Holmes nodded. "Quite right, and you were wise to come to me rather than the authorities, for now. Too often truth is suffocated beneath the weight of procedure." I rose, already reaching for my overcoat. "Shall we leave at once?" "First light will suffice," Holmes replied. "There is no gain in disturbing the house at midnight, unless we wish to advertise our arrival. Dr. Meredith, you will remain in London tonight. I trust you will meet us at Waterloo Station at 8 sharp tomorrow morning." "I shall be there." Holmes turned to me, a glint of anticipation in his eye. A new nurse, a sudden will, a death cloaked in illness, and a dying man's final riddle. There is more here than chance, Watson. Far more. And thus began a case which, though shrouded in the mundane appearance of natural decline, would lead us into one of the most cunningly veiled crimes Holmes ever laid bare. We departed from Waterloo on the 8 o'clock train to Surrey, the countryside passing in grey blurs beneath a brooding sky. Holmes was uncharacteristically silent for the greater part of the journey, his long fingers steepled and his gaze fixed beyond the carriage window. It was not until we approached the little station near Compton Hollow that he stirred with purpose. "A nurse of sudden inheritance," he murmured, "a death cloaked in symptoms easily masked, and a final utterance centred on a cough. No, Watson, there is a pattern beneath the surface of this case. We must attend closely." Upon arrival, we were met by a local cab arranged by Dr. Meredith, and in less than half an hour, the dark outline of Compton Manor emerged from the mist-laced hedgerows. The house stood solemnly at the crest of a modest rise, its many windows shuttered, its chimneys issuing no smoke. There was an air of abandonment about it, though we knew it remained inhabited. A dour housekeeper admitted us without flourish, leading us into a drawing-room whose once fine furnishings bore the signs of neglect and disuse. A heavy silence pervaded the space, broken only by the muffled ticking of a long-case clock. Dr. Meredith arrived shortly thereafter, his manner composed but taut. "You will find the household still reeling," he said softly. "Miss Compton is in the sitting-room. Nurse Faircroft is upstairs." Holmes inclined his head. "We shall speak to both. But first, Dr. Meredith, I should like to see the room where Sir Reginald passed. There is much to learn from the setting of a death." And with that, we were shown through the dim corridors of Compton Manor, each step echoing upon floorboards that seemed to groan beneath the weight of unspoken things. Before ascending to the late Sir Reginald's chambers, Holmes requested a word with Miss Compton. We were shown into a smaller parlour off the main hall, where a woman of perhaps 25 stood by the window, arms crossed over a dark morning dress. Her features bore the stamp of restrained emotion, composed but pale, dignified yet burning beneath. She turned at our entrance, her eyes settling first on Holmes, then on myself. "You are here on behalf of Dr. Meredith?" she asked. "We are," I replied. "This is Mr. Sherlock Holmes." Her brows lifted slightly, but she offered no greeting. "My uncle trusted strangers easily in his final weeks," she said, "but not his own blood." "There is reason to believe," Holmes said evenly, "the trust may have been misplaced." She said nothing, but her jaw tightened. "Do you believe Nurse Faircroft influenced your uncle?" I asked. "She influenced more than that," she said coldly. She isolated him. She dismissed the cook. She kept me away, and now she has the estate. You sound certain of foul play. I sound like a woman robbed. Holmes regarded her closely. You are bitter, Miss Compton. But is your bitterness born of loss or of jealousy? She met his gaze unflinchingly. Does it matter? Either way, she wins. Holmes made no reply, but I sensed he had noted something in her tone, or perhaps in her restraint, that told him more than her words revealed. With a short nod, he turned toward the stair. Come, Watson, he said. Let us meet the angel of the sick room. Sir Reginald's bedroom occupied the eastern corner of the upper floor. The door creaked on its hinges as the housekeeper opened it, and we stepped into a chamber that was at once stately and sombre. Heavy drapes hung motionless over tall windows, and the air bore the unmistakable scent of stale laudanum and lavender water. Holmes moved with the precision of a surgeon. He stood at the foot of the bed, his eyes darting across every inch of the room with the methodical calm of a man mapping a crime before it is declared one. Note the distance between bed and bell-pull, Watson, he said. A man in distress would not ring for amusement. The housekeeper, a pinched woman named Mrs. Keeley, stood to the side, wringing her apron in her hands. I was down in the kitchen when the bell rang, sir, but by the time I reached him, the nurse was already there. Already there? Holmes repeated. Yes, sir. She said she heard him stir and went to check. Did you see him alive? She hesitated. No, sir. Only still. Peaceful, she said. But he looked pale, grey almost. Holmes's gaze moved to the hearth. He knelt beside it, lifting a small pile of ashes with his gloved fingers. A few unburnt fragments remained, brown paper, as from a legal document. He said nothing, but pocketed a sample. Next, he turned to the bedside table, where two small vials stood, one labelled cough syrup, the other a sedative. Holmes held them to the light and frowned. No initials, no date. Curious. Yet these were likely administered by the nurse. Yes, sir, said the housekeeper. Finally, he picked up a discarded handkerchief from the floor. Its edge bore traces of dried phlegm, tinged, I observed, with a faint yellow. Holmes glanced at me. Watson! I'll examine it further, but the discharge is unusual, not consistent with chronic bronchitis. Perhaps something more acute, or introduced. Holmes nodded. Precisely. There was a pause, filled only by the ticking of a clock and the distant echo of footsteps in the hallway. The symptoms, Holmes said, may have told a tale, but it is the inconsistencies that speak the loudest. We found Nurse Lydia Faircroft in the library, seated before an untouched cup of tea and a folded copy of the Times. She rose at once upon our entrance, her manner composed, her figure slight and well postured. She could not have been older than 30, with intelligent eyes and a calmness that bordered on calculated grace. You must be Mr. Holmes, she said, extending her hand with practised courtesy. And Dr. Watson, I presume. I'd been told you might visit. Indeed, Holmes replied. We are investigating the final hours of Sir Reginald Compton. I imagine Dr. Meredith has expressed his concerns, she said, lowering her gaze. He has always struck me as rather sensitive. He spoke well of your attentiveness, Holmes returned. Perhaps you might share your recollection of that evening. There is little to tell, she said, her voice soft but unwavering. Sir Reginald had retired early. Around 11, I heard him cough, rather violently in fact, and went at once to his room. By the time I arrived, he was struggling. I administered his syrup, but it was too late. He passed within minutes. Did he speak? She hesitated. Only a murmur. I could not make it out. Holmes gave no reaction. And you were caring for him alone at that hour? Yes. The household was retired. I had taken over many of his nightly routines. You insisted upon doing so? Holmes asked lightly. Her eyes met his. I found the staff careless. I wanted him to be comfortable. Holmes inclined his head. Commendable. You are well versed in pharmacology. I trained as an apothecary's assistant before turning to nursing. How fortunate for Sir Reginald, Holmes said smoothly. His final hours were in capable hands. As we departed, I glanced at Holmes. His face was unreadable, but I saw a tension in his mouth I recognized well. She is too perfect, Watson, he murmured. A story polished at the edges. I mistrust such tidiness. Back downstairs, Holmes requested to speak again with Mrs. Keeley, the housekeeper. She met us in the corridor, outside the drawing room, her face flushed with nervous compliance. Mrs. Keeley, Holmes began gently, you mentioned earlier that Sir Reginald rang the bell the night he died. Tell me exactly what happened. She nodded. It was just after 11. I was in the scullery preparing for the morning. He'd taken to late-night requests on occasion, and I liked to be ready. Then the bell rang, sharp twice, and I went straight up. And yet, Nurse Faircroft was already there, Holmes asked. Yes, sir. I found her seated at his bedside. She said he had already passed and that she had done all she could. Was she alarmed? Not as I'd expect. Calm, really, as if it were no surprise. Holmes's brow furrowed slightly. And Sir Reginald, did you see him? I did, sir, just for a moment. His eyes were closed and there was a look, as though he'd tried to say something. Did Nurse Faircroft mention what he said? She told me he'd only coughed and faded away, but I heard him call out before the bell. Not words exactly, more like desperation. Holmes gave a slight nod and fell into thought. Thank you, Mrs. Keeley, he said. You've been most helpful. As she retreated, Holmes turned to me. There is a gap between cause and consequence here, Watson. The nurse heard a cough. The housekeeper heard a call. Somewhere between lies the moment of truth. Before leaving the house, Holmes asked to examine Sir Reginald's private study, a request which Meredith readily granted. The room bore the air of quiet disorder, as though recently disturbed and clumsily put back to rights. Holmes made a circuit of the desk, running his fingers along the papers, ledgers, and appointment books. Then, with a soft exclamation, he stopped. Watson, look here. He held up the household medical log, its entries in Meredith's hand, neat and precise. But between two dates, only 3 days before Sir Reginald's death, a page had been carefully torn away. Curious, I said. More than that, Holmes replied. This was not accidental. Someone has erased the record of administered treatment. He then turned to the drawer beneath the desk, tugged gently, and it came open with a splintered jerk. Forced, he said, examining the edge. And emptied. We found only a torn scrap inside, a corner of parchment bearing the remnants of a legal seal. The original will, I ventured. Possibly, or something more damning. Holmes placed the fragment into his pocketbook and closed the drawer with care. As we prepared to leave, Holmes paused at the threshold and turned his gaze back upon the room. She altered the scene, Watson, he murmured, but only enough to conceal, not to cleanse. We exited Compton Manor as the evening shadows lengthened across the path. Holmes was silent until we reached the gate, where he stopped suddenly and said, almost to himself, "The lungs deceive." but paper burns poorly, and a drawer never lies. On Holmes's suggestion, we paid a visit the following morning to Dr. Hubert Lowry, a retired physician who had once served the Compton family in an earlier decade. A tall, spare man with an austere manner and iron-grey hair, he received us at his modest practice in Woking, where he continued to consult on occasion. "I have heard of Dr. Meredith's concerns," he said, once introductions were complete. "He is a bright enough fellow, but young. Far too inclined toward drama, if you ask me." "You treated Sir Reginald Compton in the past?" Holmes inquired. "For several years," Lowry replied, "until I withdrew from full practice. His condition was clear: chronic bronchitis with episodes of pleuritic aggravation. I always told him it would one day carry him off." "And yet the suddenness of his demise did not strike you as unusual?" Lowry gave a dismissive wave of the hand. "With lungs like his, Mr. Holmes, it could come at any time. One sharp turn in the weather, one cold draught, one bad night's sleep." Holmes steepled his fingers. "You did not examine the body?" "Number Nurse Faircroft attended him. Dr. Meredith certified the death, and I saw no reason to interfere with either. These things happen." "And the matter of the will?" Lowry's eyes narrowed. "Not my concern. Sir Reginald had every right to alter his affairs. The niece was never a favourite. The nurse was diligent, respectful. Why should she not be rewarded?" Holmes rose. "Indeed, and thank you, Doctor. It is often the voices of experience that most confidently misread the signs." Lowry arched an eyebrow, but said nothing. Outside, Holmes spoke only once before we turned toward the village chemist. "A man may misdiagnose a living patient, Watson, but when he misdiagnoses a corpse, someone must correct the record." Returning to our modest lodgings that afternoon, I withdrew the handkerchief Holmes had earlier retrieved from Sir Reginald's chamber and placed it upon the desk. With Holmes observing silently behind me, I examined the dried residue with the practiced eye of a physician. "There is no trace of blood," I noted aloud, "nor of the darkened sputum we might expect in the case of advanced bronchitis. The material is pale, mucus-like, but it lacks density." "Which tells you what?" Holmes inquired, without looking up from his violin, which he had begun to tune idly in the corner. "That this is not the expectoration of a man in the final stages of pulmonary failure. It is, if anything, the result of irritation, perhaps chemical in nature." "Precisely," Holmes murmured. "Continue." I retrieved a small reagent bottle from my kit and added a drop to the cloth. It frothed slightly, discolouring at once. "Alkaline reaction," I said. "Possibly indicative of exposure to aconite or digitalis. Which of the two would you prefer to be poisoned by?" Holmes asked dryly. "Neither, thank you." He smiled faintly. "What strikes you as most telling, Watson?" I held the handkerchief to the light. "That it exists at all. A man suffocating naturally will cough, yes, but the frequency, volume, and composition of the sputum would tell a clearer story. This seems interrupted." Artificial Holmes nodded, rising to pace the room. "We have a handkerchief that argues against the chronic narrative, a nurse too polished in her grief, a housekeeper who heard a voice where another heard none, and a will conveniently rewritten. And yet the evidence remains circumstantial." I sat back. "Not for long, I suspect." He turned to me, eyes gleaming. "Indeed. For the nature of a poisoner is to believe that subtlety is invincibility. But subtlety, Watson, leaves a trail, far more distinct than they realise." There was a knock at the door then, hurried, uncertain. Holmes moved to answer it. Outside stood a man, gaunt and ill-shaven, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "I must speak with Mr. Holmes," he whispered. "It's about Lydia Faircroft." Holmes opened the door wider. "Then come in, Mr. Griggs, Neville Griggs, and I know what she's capable of." Mr. Neville Griggs entered our quarters with the air of a man long hunted, though whether by law or by conscience, I could not at once determine. He cast furtive glances about the room before settling into a chair Holmes offered without ceremony. "You were once acquainted with Nurse Lydia Faircroft?" Holmes asked. Griggs rubbed his jaw, nodding slowly. "More than that. We worked together for a time, years ago, in the north. I was a chemist's assistant. She was the new girl then. Quick study, clever hands. Too clever, maybe. And why have you come now?" I asked. He shifted in his seat. "I read the notice of Sir Reginald's passing. The name stuck with me. Faircroft. Not common. When I saw it was a nurse listed in the estate notices, I knew it had to be her." Holmes studied him. "You suspect her involvement?" "I know what she's done before. There was a case in Leeds, a patient who died mysteriously. I kept my mouth shut at the time. Didn't want trouble. But the whispers followed. And Lydia, she left town the next week. Was there an inquiry? None. She was smart. Used aconitine, I think. Tiny doses over days. Enough to mimic heart failure. I knew the signs. She even used to joke about it. A poison that sounds like a prayer, she'd say. And what of your role? Griggs flushed. I was no angel, Mr. Holmes. I sold compounds to the wrong people, I won't lie. But I never killed anyone. Holmes turned slightly. You believe she's done so again? I do, and I had to tell someone before it's too late for the next man. Holmes considered this, then motioned to me. Watson, make a note. Locate the death record from Leeds, inquire into the attending physicians, and cross-check for any unsigned prescriptions. He returned his attention to Griggs. You've done the right thing, Mr. Griggs. If your account holds, this woman's past is darker than we supposed. Griggs stood, already edging toward the door. Be careful with her, sir. She looks like an angel, but she's cold as a mortuary slab. With that, he departed, leaving Holmes silent for a moment. She dismissed the cook, Watson. That fact alone now gleams like silver in a muddy field. You believe she administered the poison directly? Holmes's reply was grave. I believe we must find the vessel she used, and quickly, before the past repeats itself. Later that day, while Holmes pursued a discreet telegram inquiry from the village post, I took the opportunity to speak again with Miss Beatrice Compton. She was seated in the winter parlour, pale and withdrawn, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She did not rise when I entered, but inclined her head with mechanical civility. You suspect her as well, don't you? She asked quietly, before I had even opened my notebook. We are pursuing all lines of inquiry, I said with the practiced diplomacy Holmes had instilled in me. But I was told that Nurse Faircroft assumed full control over your uncle's evening treatments. Her eyes fixed on the fire. That is true. It began not long after her arrival. First, she objected to the cook's preparation of broth and gruel, claimed it lacked proper consistency for a man of such delicate constitution. Then she offered to handle the dietary regimen herself. The cook was dismissed within a week. And the medicine? She alone prepared it, Beatrice said bitterly. A syrup taken before bed, lavender tincture and laudanum, she claimed. She mixed it in the scullery and brought it up each night. No one else was permitted to assist. You never questioned this? At first, no. She had an air of authority. My uncle trusted her, but as his health declined, she became less like a nurse and more like a sentinel. She scarcely let me speak to him alone. There was a pause before she added, in a voice little more than a whisper, "I believe she planned this, Doctor. Watson, I believe she poisoned him slowly, patiently, and with confidence no one would notice." I relayed her words to Holmes that evening. He received them with a curt nod. "It confirms what we feared," he said. "Now all that remains is to find the vessel, and in that vessel, the truth." It was the following morning that Holmes insisted we pay a visit to the greenhouse, a glass enclosure at the rear of the estate that, according to the groundskeeper, had not been entered in days. The man himself had been dismissed shortly before Sir Reginald's death. Another curious dismissal, Holmes had noted with growing interest. "It is the least monitored structure on the property," Holmes said as we approached. "And poisoners, Watson, are not sentimental creatures. They destroy their instruments, but not always cleverly." Inside the greenhouse, the air was humid and stale. We moved through rows of withering potted plants and brittle herbs. Holmes's gaze swept the perimeter with intensity. Then, in the far corner, half concealed beneath a wilted planter, he knelt and gave a sharp intake of breath. He reached down and drew forth what remained of a glass vial, shattered at the base but still capped, with minute traces of residue clinging to the inner rim. The label had been removed, but the shape and manufacture suggested recent use. He held it up. "Behold, Watson, our missing vessel. Is it the one used for the cough syrup?" I asked. "I believe so. But more importantly, it was not disposed of, it was concealed, hidden beneath soil and foliage. That tells us it held something incriminating, something she feared might be traced." He examined the rim with a magnifier. "No fingerprints, but the contents may speak." Just then, a fragment of paper caught my eye nearby, wedged beneath a cracked terracotta pot. I handed it to Holmes. It was nothing more than a torn scrap, but the ink was still legible. "Administer only in diluted form, lest—" Holmes's lips thinned. "Instructions for a compound, possibly from a medical journal or pharmacological guide." She used this as reference, and then she buried the evidence. He wrapped the vial carefully in cloth. "The greenhouse will yield no more," he said, "but this shard holds the breath of the crime. All that remains is to test it." We stepped out into the cold light. Holmes paused, glancing back once. "She buried her secret," he said, "as one might bury the dead, quietly, but not deeply enough." That same afternoon, Holmes made arrangements with a chemist of his acquaintance in Guildford, a man named Hawthorne, whose discretion and skill he trusted implicitly. While we awaited the results of the residue analysis, Holmes paced our sitting room in relentless silence, the only sound the faint ticking of his pocket watch and the occasional crack of the fire. "It will be aconitine," he said finally, more to himself than to me. "There is a particular quality to this case, a slowness, an elegance of execution that bears the mark of that dreadful plant. Monkshood, the poison of scholars and shadows." I said nothing, for I knew he was working through the possibilities aloud. When the telegram came, Holmes tore it open with deliberate care. After a moment, he handed it to me. "Trace elements, consistent with aconitine, residue matches, symptomatic profile." Holmes closed his eyes briefly. "She was meticulous," he said, "but not invincible. The compound bears her signature." We returned at once to Compton Manor. Holmes requested that all parties be gathered in the drawing room that evening. Miss Compton, Dr. Meredith, Nurse Faircroft, and the family solicitor. No explanation was given. Before the hour appointed, Holmes and I made one final pass through the house. In the linen closet adjacent to Nurse Faircroft's quarters, Holmes retrieved a cloth pouch stitched in green. Inside was a small mortar and pestle, faintly dusted with lavender and something far more bitter. "She prepared it here," he said grimly, "apart from the kitchen, apart from all eyes." Then, turning to me, he added in a voice low and cold, "The circle tightens, Watson. She killed once. She may kill again, but not before I bring her every breath back upon her." It was just before dusk when Holmes convened the household within the drawing room of Compton Manor. A fire had been lit, more for formality than warmth, and the atmosphere crackled with the tension of half-spoken suspicions. Holmes stood near the mantel, hands behind his back, his profile sharp in the dimming light. Seated before him were Miss Beatrice Compton, rigid with quiet defiance, Dr. Meredith, visibly uneasy, yet resolved, Mr. Chandler, the family solicitor, whose spectacles slid nervously down his nose, and lastly, Nurse Lydia Faircroft, who had positioned herself apart from the others, her expression as still and unreadable as porcelain. "I thank you all for coming," Holmes began, his voice calm but clipped. "I appreciate that the recent days have been fraught with uncertainty, particularly regarding the matter of Sir Reginald's estate. I have asked Mr. Chandler to be present to provide clarity on the legal standing of the revised testament." Mr. Chandler gave a nervous cough and adjusted his papers, but Holmes raised a hand. "I must first speak plainly. We are not gathered merely to resolve questions of inheritance. We are here because I have reason to believe a grave injustice has been committed, one hidden beneath the guise of natural illness." There was a faint shift in the room, an imperceptible tightening of breath. Holmes turned to the solicitor. "Mr. Chandler, is it correct that the amended will was signed 3 days before Sir Reginald's death?" Yes, that is so." "And witnessed solely by Miss Faircroft and Sir Reginald's manservant, who has since left the country?" That is also true." Holmes nodded. "Curious, is it not, that both the primary witness and the primary beneficiary now stand beyond scrutiny?" He stepped forward. "But I assure you, scrutiny shall not be evaded." Nurse Faircroft raised her chin slightly. "Is there an accusation in your tone, Mr. Holmes?" "Not yet, Miss Faircroft," he replied, "but I suspect you may find one forming." At that moment, I knew we stood upon the cusp of revelation, and that Holmes, as ever, would reveal it with surgical precision. Holmes reached into his breast pocket and withdrew a folded sheet of cream-coloured paper. He opened it deliberately and laid it upon the small side table near the fire. "This arrived this morning," he said, though I knew full well he had written it himself. "An anonymous note. The author claims to possess knowledge of the true cause of Sir Reginald's death, and alludes, most curiously, to a clue hidden in a cough." The phrase seemed to echo in the chamber. Nurse Faircroft's eyes remained fixed upon the page, but her lips drew into a thin line. Holmes allowed a beat of silence before continuing. "I thought it only fair," he said lightly, "that all interested parties be made aware. Whoever penned this letter, be it a mischievous crank or a guilty conscience, suggests that the final moments of Sir Reginald Compton were not so benign as previously assumed." Beatrice leaned forward. "And what does the letter say precisely?" Holmes took up the page and read aloud, his tone precise and measured. He coughed not from illness but from interference. A foreign agent lingered in his lungs. He tried to speak but died before he could. The truth lies in the change, the cough before the end. The nurse knows it. The cough gave her away. Silence fell like a drawn curtain. Dr. Meredith stirred uncomfortably. "Surely this is mere conjecture." Holmes met his gaze. "Unless it is not." Miss Faircroft gave a delicate laugh, though it rang strangely in the room. How convenient for your investigation, Mr. Holmes, that such a letter should surface at precisely the right moment. Convenient, Holmes replied, but not fabricated. The phrasing, the change in the cough, is precisely what troubled Dr. Meredith and led him to my door. Her lips parted as if to reply, then closed again. Holmes turned toward me. Watson, do you recall what I said in the greenhouse? You said she buried her secret, but not deeply enough. Holmes faced the others once more. Some secrets, it seems, dig themselves out. At that moment, the tension in the room became a living thing, and all eyes turned to the nurse, who sat still, very still, but whose fingers had begun to tremble ever so slightly. I have seen many faces fold under pressure, thieves before judges, murderers in the dock, but rarely have I observed a transformation so swift as that which overtook Nurse Faircroft. She rose abruptly, smoothing her skirt with a nervous hand. "This is absurd," she said. "If anyone is implying that I had any role in Sir Reginald's passing, I must protest in the strongest terms." Holmes gave her a polite nod. "Then protest you shall, but I advise you to remain seated." "I will not be accused without cause," she exclaimed, taking a step toward the door. "This is slanderous, Mr. Holmes, slanderous and illegal." Holmes did not move, but his voice dropped an octave. "I suggest you sit down, Miss Faircroft. Should you attempt to leave this room, I shall place into the hands of Mr. Chandler and the local magistrate a vial, recovered from the greenhouse, containing traces of aconitine. The residue has already been analysed and confirmed. Alongside it, a torn page bearing pharmacological instructions, and a cloth found in your quarters bearing the same powder used in Sir Reginald's so-called cough syrup." She froze. For a moment, her breath seemed to catch. Then she moved again, but not toward the door. She staggered slightly, caught the edge of a chair and lowered herself into it, her composure failing inch by inch. "There is more," Holmes said gently, though the steel beneath his tone was unmistakable. "Sir Reginald rang the bell that night, twice. The housekeeper heard his voice. You said he uttered nothing, but he did speak. He said, 'He knows. The cough.'" Her hand went to her throat. "That cough," Holmes continued, "was the voice of the poison you fed him, masked beneath trust, disguised as care. You believed the illness would shield you. He stepped forward, but it betrayed you." There was no scream, no wail of guilt, only silence, and the faint rhythmic shiver of a woman who knew the net had closed. Holmes did not press her further at that moment. Instead, with the room cloaked in tension and eyes fixed on him, he turned to the small table beside the hearth, where he had earlier arranged a modest case. From within, he withdrew the carefully wrapped remnants of the shattered vial and set them upon the table with the same deliberate care he might show a rare artifact. "Let us speak of facts," he said. "The vial you see before you was discovered buried beneath a clay planter in the greenhouse. It bore no label, yet the residue inside was consistent, as confirmed by independent analysis, with aconitine, an alkaloid extracted from monkshood, a poison, slow-acting and easily masked by pre-existing respiratory distress." He held up a thin glass slide, upon which a faint smear of residue had been placed and stained with reagent. "This, ladies and gentlemen, is the ghost of the crime, the invisible hand that took Sir Reginald's life. It is tasteless, odourless, and lethal in the right dose. It mirrors pulmonary failure so closely that only the most careful eye would detect the difference." Dr. Meredith leaned forward, eyes wide. Then my instinct, my unease, it was not unfounded. Holmes inclined his head. On the contrary, Doctor, it was the very heartbeat of truth. He turned toward the nurse now, who sat motionless, her complexion pale and her eyes fixed upon the fire. But the poison was not merely administered, it was disguised, cleverly so, within a syrup meant to ease the patient's nightly cough. A ritual of mercy became the vehicle of murder. He now retrieved the torn page, recovered from beneath the greenhouse pot, and read its faded line aloud. Administer only in diluted form, lest convulsion precede expiration. A page from a pharmacological reference kept as instruction. The presence of lavender and laudanum masked the taste. The cough grew sharper in those final nights, not because the illness worsened, but because the poison agitated the bronchial passage. He stepped back from the table. Miss Faircroft did not merely poison Sir Reginald, she relied on the very credibility of medicine and of kindness to cloak her crime. It was, I thought, the most damning proof Holmes had ever laid before a crowd. After a long silence, broken only by the rustle of shifting limbs and the wheeze of the fire, Holmes resumed in a voice as calm as it was devastating. "You may ask," he said, "how a mere cough could unravel such a crime." He stepped forward, addressing all of us, but never removing his gaze from the nurse. When Sir Reginald spoke his final words, he was in the grip of a fit, a violent, spasmodic cough, wholly unlike those Dr. Meredith had recorded previously. And yet it is precisely in that difference that the truth revealed itself. He paced slowly. In chronic bronchitis, the cough is familiar to the patient and to his physician. Dry, recurring, exhausting, yet seldom violent. But the housekeeper, Mrs. Keeley, testified that she heard not only the bell, but a cry, a final effort to speak. That cry came not from illness, but from recognition. Sir Reginald knew something had changed. Holmes stopped and looked at Meredith. "You yourself observed the difference. The mucus was lighter, the sound more guttural. A new pattern had emerged, and in a man whose life had been ruled by respiratory routine, such a shift is significant." He turned toward Nurse Faircroft once more. "It was the timing, you see. She altered the dosage too quickly. The symptoms escalated, and he realized, too late, that his breath had been turned against him." At this, Faircroft stirred, her hands now clenched in her lap, the mask of serenity beginning to crack. Holmes concluded with quiet force. Had he lived even a minute longer, he might have uttered more, but his words were enough. "He knows the cough." He did not mean Dr. Meredith. He meant me. He meant whoever would follow the change, trace the pattern, and hear, at last, the truth within the sound. And in that instant, the room felt as though it, too, was holding its breath. There was no thunderous collapse, no melodramatic cry of guilt. Instead, Nurse Faircroft sat very still, her face drained of colour, her breath shallow. The silence held her in its grip, and for a moment it seemed she might hold to her composure even still. Then came a movement, slight, almost imperceptible. Her shoulders fell, her hands, once folded with precision, opened and trembled on her lap. "You have no proof I gave it to him," she whispered, "only that it was there." Holmes approached, his tone now solemn rather than accusatory. "But you did, Miss Faircroft. You dismissed the cook. You prepared his food. You administered the medicine. You removed the prescription log and burned the original will. You were alone with him at the hour of death, and he named you, indirectly, but clearly." Her eyes shimmered with restrained fury, then softened with something far more human. "I didn't mean for it to go that far," she said. "At first, It was only to ease him. He said he wanted peace. I gave it to him. But then, Holmes said gently now, you realized how much more peace could offer. She nodded slowly, the tears now falling freely. I altered the dose. I knew he would go quietly. I thought it would be merciful. Mercy, Holmes said, is not measured by inheritance. And with that, she buried her face in her hands and wept, not for justice, I think, but for having been seen so clearly. It was a grey morning when Holmes and I returned to Baker Street, the fog curling low along the eaves and chimneys of the city, like a secret still unspoken. The events at Compton Manor had left me in a state of brooding contemplation, and for the better part of the journey back to London, I remained silent, turning the affair over in my mind. Holmes, for his part, was as composed as ever. Once settled in his armchair, he resumed his habitual pipe and glanced through the morning paper as though he had returned from nothing more than a walk in Hyde Park. I cannot help but feel, I said at last, that the case turned not on the poison, nor even on the nurse's concealment, but on something far smaller. Holmes looked up. Indeed, Watson, you are correct. The resolution did not lie in the grand gesture, but in the overlooked detail. As ever, it is the whisper, not the shout, which carries the truth. I nodded slowly, and yet I still marvel at how you deduced so much from so little. He gestured toward the fire. We shall walk through it together then, and you shall see that there was, in fact, nothing small about the signs, only in how carefully they were hidden. I poured us each a measure of brandy, for the air had turned chill, and resumed my place across from him. Outside, the city moved on in its indifferent rhythm, but within the rooms of Baker Street, the final threads of one man's death and one woman's guilt were being drawn together with the precision of a surgeon's stitch. Begin with the handkerchief, I said. It seemed to matter so greatly to you. Holmes smiled faintly. Ah, yes, the silence of the handkerchief. Let us begin there indeed. Holmes reached for the folded cloth I had preserved during our examination at Compton Manor, and held it between his fingers as one might handle a fragment of lost scripture. You see, Watson, the handkerchief is not merely a receptacle, it is a record. The lungs speak through it, if one is prepared to listen. I leaned forward. But the sputum, it was pale, thin, unremarkable. Unremarkable to most, he replied, but not to us. A man with chronic bronchitis, particularly in its terminal stage, produces a dense, purulent discharge, often tinged with blood or darkened by infection. What we found here was neither. You noted the absence of inflammation, I said. Precisely. No trace of hemoptysis, no signs of vascular rupture, nothing that would suggest an acute decline. In short, the handkerchief told us that Sir Reginald's death was not the culmination of illness, but the orchestration of something else entirely. He rose and began to pace. Moreover, the very presence of the handkerchief was telling. She left it, either by carelessness or calculation, but she could not alter its contents. It contradicted the diagnosis of natural respiratory failure. He paused, tapping the fabric lightly with one finger. It was the silent witness, Watson. Where the body yielded no cry, the cloth preserved the truth. I felt a chill. And in that truth, Holmes continued, we found the first fracture in her carefully constructed facade. She had studied poison, yes, but she had not studied pathology with equal diligence. He returned to his chair, eyes glowing faintly in the firelight. There is something almost poetic about it, don't you think? That a murder so deliberate, so elegantly timed, should be undone by what the victim expelled in his final moments. I nodded slowly. Indeed, I said. A cough and a cloth, and with them the voice of the dead returned. Holmes said nothing, but the flicker of satisfaction in his gaze told me he agreed. Holmes now retrieved from his desk a small envelope, which he had carefully sealed at Compton Manor. From within, he withdrew several charred fragments of paper, burnt at the edges, but with the ink still visible in places. These, he said, were retrieved from the grate in Sir Reginald's chamber. You recall I examined the ashes while the housekeeper spoke? I nodded. I remember you said they looked legal in form. Indeed, the watermark, even in partial ruin, bore the crest of Chandler and Hunt, the family's legal firm. The edge here, note the binding puncture, was once part of a multi-page document. He laid the fragments on the table. I have compared the handwriting, what little remains, with a known sample of Sir Reginald's script. And here, just here, you may make out the words, "To my niece, Beatrice Compton," followed by an almost obliterated clause, "the entirety of my estate." I leaned in closer. So the original will was destroyed. Exactly, Holmes said. And not merely discarded, but incinerated, deliberately and incompletely. She sought to remove all traces of the document which gave the estate to its rightful heir. He folded the remnants gently. But as so often happens, Watson, haste is the great betrayer of cleverness. She had neither the time nor the expertise to ensure total destruction. The fireplace, though an apt symbol for finality, often serves poorly as a means of concealment. And the page missing from the prescription log. Another deletion, this one medical rather than legal. An effort to erase the dosage record, but too many threads were left dangling. I exhaled. So the motive was proven by fire, the murder by powder, and the truth by breath. Holmes allowed himself a rare, quiet smile. Well put, my dear fellow. Well put indeed. Holmes now turned to the final item of circumstantial corroboration, the prescription log. You will recall, he said, tapping the small leather-bound book upon the table, that the household's medication records were maintained with admirable consistency by Dr. Meredith, until precisely 3 days before Sir Reginald's death. He opened the ledger and pointed to the space between two entries. Here a page has been removed, not carelessly but deliberately, with a razor or thin blade. The tear is clean, the fibres sheared, and no accidental blot remains. I studied the gap. You believe it once contained a record of the fatal dose? I do, Holmes said firmly. It is the only logical inference. Nurse Faircroft, who had taken it upon herself to prepare and administer the nightly syrup, would have entered the composition herself, or had Dr. Meredith do so under her dictation. He folded the book shut with a soft thud. But when the moment came, when the dosage crossed from therapeutic to fatal, she removed the record. Not because it proved poison in itself, but because it charted a pattern. Small increases, almost imperceptible, but building toward a terminal threshold. I exhaled. A slow death by increments. Precisely, Holmes murmured. And that is where the genius of her crime lay. Not in the method, but in the concealment. She did not strike with violence. She withdrew by degrees, a fraction more each night until the body gave way. And yet, I said, the page she tore left its own trace. Holmes nodded. Absence often speaks louder than presence, my dear Watson. A blank space is still a message, if one is trained to read silence. And so, the missing record, like the cough and the cloth, became not a gap in evidence, but evidence itself. Holmes retrieved the sealed vial, now safely encased within a glass tube from Hawthorne's laboratory, and placed it reverently on the table between us. Few poisons are as misunderstood or as misused as aconitine, he began. It is the product of the monkshood plant, a blossom of astonishing aesthetic beauty, and, paradoxically, one of the most merciless weapons in a chemist's arsenal. I studied the pale residue clinging to the glass. It mimics illness? I asked. Quite elegantly, Holmes replied. In small repeated doses, it produces sensations of weakness, nausea, respiratory disturbance, and arrhythmic palpitations. To the uninformed or the overly trusting, it resembles the natural deterioration of age or affliction. It does not seize the body with violence. It wears it down with mimicry. He leaned forward slightly. That is why Nurse Faircroft chose it. It aligned itself so neatly with Sir Reginald's medical history. Its symptoms mirrored his chronic bronchitis, but with just enough exaggeration to mask her manipulation. And yet, I mused, had she simply administered a large, fatal dose, the signs might have betrayed her. Exactly. She was too clever for that. She relied on patience, not haste. But therein lies her undoing. A fast death may shock, but a slow one accumulates evidence. He gestured to the various articles spread across the table. The cloth, the torn journal page, the vial, the ashes of the will. All of it, the method, the motive, the means, hinged upon this single substance. The cough syrup was not merely a delivery mechanism. It was a performance. She had to maintain the illusion of care even as she dismantled the man's life, breath by breath. He paused, folding his hands together. I have always maintained, Watson, that murderers reveal themselves not merely in what they do, but in what they understand. She understood aconitine. She understood illness. But she did not understand the sound of truth when it escapes the lungs. I could not help but shudder. And in the end, Holmes concluded softly, it was not the poison that condemned her, it was the precision with which she applied it. There was, in the entire case, no element so deceptively ordinary, yet so damning as the cough itself. It is strange, I said, how something so mundane could unmask such a calculated act. Holmes raised a brow. Strange to most, perhaps, but not to me. He rose and began his habitual pacing, his fingertips joined lightly at his chin. Do you recall, Watson, what the housekeeper said? That Sir Reginald's final cry was not a word, but a gasp, half-spoken, half-drowned in phlegm? I nodded, and that Nurse Faircroft insisted he said nothing at all. A lie, subtle but intentional. She could not repeat what he'd said, because she understood its meaning. He turned toward me. The phrase "he knows the cough" was not metaphorical. It was literal. Sir Reginald, in his final moment, recognized the change in his own breathing. The pattern, the rhythm, had shifted. It was not the cough he had known for years. It was harsher, deeper. Artificial Holmes gestured toward the armchair. That is the moment, Watson. That second of awareness. That realization that his body had been turned against him. And he tried to name it. He spoke now with solemn clarity. To the layman, a cough is but a nuisance. To the dying, it is a signal. To the killer, it is a cloak. But to the detective, it is a code. And in this case, it told me more than any testimony ever could. He sat once more, the firelight casting long shadows behind him. A cough may echo in the dark, Watson, but if one listens well, it will speak. We sat in silence for a long while after Holmes concluded his account. The case, though solved, still echoed in my mind. not merely for its ingenuity, but for its quiet cruelty. Holmes, ever unreadable, at last broke the stillness. It is often in the most delicate of disturbances, the rattle in a throat, the tremble in a word, that the devil does his work, he said. A cough, my dear Watson, is as telling as a confession, if only one listens closely enough. I nodded, though I found no words in response. Outside, the city murmured with the noises of life. Horses in the street, footsteps on the pavement, the distant cry of a newsboy. But within our rooms, it was the echo of that single cough which lingered, a signal from the grave, a whisper no longer ignored. And as Holmes returned to his violin and drew the bow slowly across its strings, I opened my notebook and wrote the final line of a tale that had begun with the most innocent of symptoms and ended with the most unforgivable of sins. Holmes stood by the window, gazing out at the grey drizzle settling over Baker Street, his profile etched in shadow. He had said little for the past hour, save for a few murmured notes on his violin. Then, without turning, he spoke. You know, Watson, men often speak of death as a silence, but more often it is a sound that betrays them. I looked up from my chair. You refer to the cough? He nodded. Exactly. In the end, it was not the vial, nor the will, nor even her confession that proved her guilt. It was the sound, the one thing she could not silence nor anticipate. Murder is a violent act, yes, but the clever ones try to make it look gentle. They forget that the body has its own way of crying out. He paused, then added more quietly. And it is in the smallest disturbances, the change in breath, the shift in tone, that the truth so often hides. I said nothing, knowing better than to disturb a man who had listened so closely to what no one else could hear. What do you think was Lydia Faircroft's greatest mistake? Was it the missing page from the logbook, the burnt will left half consumed? Or was it perhaps that fatal underestimation of a single cough? We'd love to hear your theory. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this case, don't forget to subscribe for more classic Sherlock Holmes mysteries and share this story with fellow detectives who never miss a clue. Until next time, keep your ears sharp and your questions sharper.